Welcome back. I hope that was useful for you to really focus on the core of what it is that is interesting and important about your research, perhaps even what's interesting and important about your research in one particular chapter of your PhD. And it was really, really important that we spent time on that, because as an editor of a journal, the thing that is most important to me is that a prospective author tells me why their article matters, what's important about it, why I or any other reader should care about it. It's the single thing that will cause an article to fail to be published if there is no attempt to explain why it matters, why it's important, why readers should care. If there's one thing you take away from this session, let it be that you need to understand and communicate what is important about your research. So in this section, we're going to move from taking that thing, that core of what matters in your research, and how we turn it into a story. We're moving from the why to the what. Why the research matters to what the article is about. I began at the beginning of the session by highlighting how an article or a book is a story, and in that sense different from a PhD. A PhD is all the stuff that you know, whereas an article or a book tells a story. Let's think about that in a little bit more detail. What is the story and how are you going to tell it? You'll most likely identify your story in conjunction with thinking about the target journal for publication. Write a list of 2 or 3 journals that you think might be an appropriate place to publish your work. What kinds of things are its readers typically interested in? And then, given that those are their interests, why will they want to read what you have written? And here's one rule of thumb to bear in mind. Remember that everyone is a lot less expert than you think. And that has real implications for making your story matter. The brutal truth is that just because you want to write it doesn't mean any other people want to read it. You're fascinated because you've been looking at it for 3 years. Other people have been looking at other topics for 3 years or 23 years, and they think theirs is the most interesting possible topic. You have to persuade them. You have to take what they're interested in and persuade them that their research and their approach will be the less unless they take on board what you have found out. And in that sense, academic writing is a lot closer to commercial writing than I think we often admit. We have to work hard to pull our readers in. They won't automatically find it fascinating. So here's what's unique about the story form of humanities articles. A science article or a social science article typically simply poses a question, taking it as read that it is a valid question, and then it answers it. So, typical questions might be, does drug X reduce the average length of flu symptoms? Here's the experiment, here's the answer. Or in social science, does social media usage correlate with mental health, either positively or negative? And they do the research and they give you an answer to that question, and so on. Question, results, answer. In the humanities, it's more subtle because you have to persuade your audience that the question or the implicit question is valid. It's not the same as science where it's just taken as read that that's a valid question. You've got to persuade them that you're asking the right question to begin with. So here are a few typical ways of structuring a humanities article. These are the narrative forms that you can use. I'm going to share my screen and I hope that you can see it as well on one of the handouts that you've been given. So here's a first very simple and obvious form. You think that we're talking to the reader here. Reader, you think you know X, but actually I've discovered Y. It's a correction of or a challenge to what is already known. And a reader will definitely want to read that if they're in the same field as you. If they think they understand something, they know about it, but you have got a correction or a challenge to that, they will definitely want to read that. So an example of that, very famous example in the field of history of science, might be to make the argument that it's commonly believed that experiment was established in science because it was an epistemologically reliable way of discovering things about nature. But aha, this article by Stephen Chapin is going to tell you that that wasn't why experiment was established. It was established in the early modern period because it was a way of solving a social problem about politeness. Wow, you thought you knew this, you thought you understood what this was, what its purpose was, but look, I've come along as a historian and I've shown you that it's something completely different from what it was. So you think you know X, but actually Y. That's really exciting if you've got one of that format. You're doing something really dramatic and important in the field. A second format is more methodological in approach, and there's two slightly different ways of doing this. So you think A tells you about X, but here's what B tells you about X. It tells you something different about it. So an example of that, a recent one from the British Journal of the History of Science, was you think you know all about entomology in the 19th century because of those books that were published by famous people. But look, I'm going to show you what amateur entomology magazines were all about. And that gives us a different picture of what X, in this instance entomology, is really like. There's another slightly different form of this argument, which is that you think that A tells you about X, this method A tells you about X, but actually we've discovered that method A tells us more about something else altogether, that this method, this type of source that we were looking at is even more useful when we apply it to that field instead. So you're making really a methodological claim in this paper. It's not something that you found out, which was the first type, but you're trying a different tool on the same thing, or you're using the same tool but trying it on something different, and you've got something different to say as a result. A third format for an article is one that deepens, widens, or refines our knowledge of a topic. So in one sense, it's like I'm going to say slightly less ambitious version of the first model, although perhaps that's unkind. It's not realistic that we're always going to be doing narratives of the first format. So it's simply really, you're interested in X, but just wait until you hear about Y. It deepens and widens our knowledge of a topic. So examples of this within the history of science have been examples that tell us about hidden labor within science, or reveal to us the globalized and colonialized elements of scientific work. So you've heard all about those famous British physicists in the 19th century, but here's what we find out about meteorological work when we find out about the Indian workers at stations of measurements and so on. We get a different vision of what this whole thing is about. The fourth model is a really simple one, and it's definitely not to be underestimated, and I think it's really often the best model for a conference presentation. And it's really quite simply show and tell. It starts with the case study that you have in hand, and then it unpacks it and shows its relevance to all kinds of different areas, maybe not even just X, maybe lots of different kinds of things. So it just, it takes something really juicy and then unpacks it and shows its significance in perhaps 2 or 3 different areas. So another recent example of that from BJHS would be an author who basically comes along in his paper and says, let me tell you all about early modern theories of monetary circulation. Now, doesn't that make you think in all sorts of new and exciting ways about William Harvey and the circulation of the blood from the same period? So it unpacks something that I wasn't expecting and shows new significance. Another example would be one about hygiene exhibitions. I had no idea that there were these commercial hygiene exhibitions in the late 19th century. And I was just fascinated by this thing. And then the author went on and told me how that contributed to, or ought to contribute to, my understanding of things like public health, health and commerce, the history of museums. A wonderful case study, and it began to illuminate all kinds of new areas. So extremely useful and exciting stuff. I really recommend that you analyse articles as you read them with an eye to this kind of structural feature. Ask yourself which kind of model they fit out of the ones I've described, or perhaps there are additional models that I haven't covered here that you start to notice in the literature for your own field. To reiterate something that's perhaps quite a subtle point, these are structures for paper, but at the same time, they are the means to carve out the validity of the paper's very existence. In other words, they're structures that persuade the reader why your research matters. It gives them a shape and a form to want that knowledge and to incorporate it into what they already know about. So here's the second exercise. If you've already identified the topic or the chapter that you want to turn into an article, spend some time thinking about how you might shape it in, let's say, 2 of these different models. What would be the X and the Y in each case? Who is your reader? And which model do you think works best for you? Or if you haven't yet identified your own focus, then analyse the 2 articles that you've brought with you. Which model do they conform to? What are their X's and Y's? And could you potentially see a better way for them to structure what they've done?